Hi, Dr. Versalati here, and in this screencast, we're going to talk about a few of the important principles of cognition as it relates to L2 language learning. In the cognitive approach, specifically the information processing, researchers studied language performance as a way of understanding language learning. Why? Well, we can't directly see a learner's understanding of a language, but we can see what learners can do with their knowledge of that language in language performance, such as writing or speaking. And there are three key assumptions: cognition, computation, and cognitive resources that we're going to talk about in this screencast. So first, cognition. Cognition has two parts: representation, which we can also think of as knowledge, like grammatical knowledge, lexical knowledge, and even world-related knowledge. And we also, as part of our cognition, not only do we have that knowledge, but we have to access it. We have to process it. We have to get to that knowledge. I'm sure we've all had that experience of we know that person's name or that actor's name, but we can't quite get there yet. We know it, but we're trying to access it. So that's the two parts of cognition: knowledge and processing, or representation and access. So let's talk a little bit more about the access and the processing. So that can also be broken into two parts. One is automatic, which is less effortful processing, and that requires fewer cognitive resources. And there's controlled processing, which takes more effort and more cognitive resources. Now we have both automatic and controlled processing in our L1 and in our L2. Automatic routines, especially in our L1, we don't usually even recognize them until there's a mistake. Maybe you've had this happen where somebody says good morning and the person replies fine thanks, because that was just an automatic processing. There wasn't much cognitive resources being used, and we only really notice it when there's a mistake. Now, controlled processing likely slows our performance down because it takes cognitive resources. And one consequence of that is that our performance will be variable, meaning that we might do it right one time, but not the next. Think about what that means when it's we're a language learner, right? I know I've been in this situation where I know something and I've done it correct, and the next time I've given that same item, I do the wrong thing, or I think it's the wrong word or something. It's variable because it still takes a lot of effort for me to do it. It's not automatic. And the other issue with controlled processing that's more effortful and takes more cognitive resources is that it's vulnerable to stressors. For instance, when we're doing a difficult task, maybe trying to explain something more complex, our performance might lower. Again, think about what that means for learners who are trying to access their knowledge of an L2. Now, the next point is the computation. And mental processing is dual, meaning we have the automatic or the fluent as well as the voluntary and the controlled, where both are happening. Another important key is that cognitive resources are limited in this information processing cognitive approach. And we're going to focus on two main cognitive resources here: working memory and attention. Let's start with working memory. So working memory do a lot of things in our working memory. We make generalizations, we form hypotheses, we do analogical reasoning and prioritization and control decision making, and we process information all using our working memory. And we use all these skills in language production. And working memory capacity is smaller in the L2. So what's the implications of that? Maybe we'll talk a little bit slower because our working memory is trying to do all of those things with limited resources. We might pause more, we might create shorter utterances and sentences, and we are likely to make even grammar mistakes, right? Because our working memory is being tasked with all of these things. So the other limitation is attention. Our cognitive resources to pay attention is also limited. And again, this is in our L1 and our L2. Because our attention is limited, we might have to be selective in what we pay attention to. For instance, maybe one time we'll be attending to meaning, and another time we might be attending to grammar, especially in our L2, of course. Maybe and it's voluntary, so maybe we'll choose to pay attention to something that we just learned or we just reviewed in our grammar point. So while we are doing our language performance, our speech or our writing, we might give our attention voluntarily, selectively to those grammar points, right? We might choose to pay attention to one aspect of our language performance. And we have to, in this theory, pay attention. We have that choice, but it's also limited. So that's encouraging us to focus because we can't pay attention to everything all at once. And this connects with the noticing hypothesis, right? There's a limitation of our working memory and attention. And the noticing hypothesis says learning requires us to be aware at the time of learning. So how do we, as L2 researchers, language learning researchers, know when a learner is aware? Well, sometimes it's done by checking awareness with a self-report. So for instance, after doing a language performance, we could ask the learners to listen to their performance or read over their essay and look for self-corrections, right? We could, because of those limitations of working memory and attention, learners do produce errors. So we could then give them an opportunity to apply their declarative knowledge, if they have the declarative knowledge, of course, assuming that they have that knowledge, by asking them to self-correct after the performance. Then, and the idea behind that is that after the performance, when they're no longer producing the language, they'll have time and available cognitive resources to think about and apply that declarative knowledge to make corrections. Now, the noticing hypothesis does not claim that learners have to remain aware. So that's a bit of a problem, because even if while you're giving a performance in your second language, maybe afterwards you forget what you might have been aware of at the time. So another way, maybe we can check awareness during the performance. For instance, by looking at self-correction during the speech itself, or even hesitations during the speech itself. So that's something we can think about. If we consider all of what we what this framework thinks about, information processing thinks about limitations of working memory, limitations of attention. When would learners correct more often? After the speech, when supposedly there'd be more cognitive resources available since they're not talking. What would the learner self-correct? Will they focus on vocabulary or meaning? Or would they focus more on grammar, even though grammar doesn't necessarily hinder effective communication, right? If you say 3 cat, the meaning isn't lost, it's just ungrammatical. What about incorrect corrections? We talked about how working memory does a lot. We do a lot in our working memory, like applying declarative knowledge. But maybe when our working memory is taxed, maybe we'll make incorrect generalizations. So we could even make incorrect corrections. So there's lots to think about when we look at learner performance, especially if we think about their self-corrections, because their performance, if everything goes well, there's not much to study other than they're doing well. But when there are mistakes, that gives us some ideas of where they are in their development, what they know and what they don't yet fully know about the language. So, in the cognitive approach, specifically information processing, we have representation and access. And remember that when it's controlled access and processing, it's more effortful, requires more cognitive resources, so it can be variable, and it's vulnerable to stressors. So how do we get from controlled to automatic? Well, in this theory of skill acquisition, there's a process where what we know about the language, right, the declarative knowledge, this is particularly in instructed context, is proceduralized or automatized, and it's converted to implicit knowledge. For instance, maybe a learner knows the plural marker s should be on plural nouns, but may not be able to always produce it in a speech. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Well, how will that improve? How will that performance, that skill be acquired? Practice, 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 right? Repeated retrieval of the forms, and that will improve the skill. Just like learning the piano or learning a dance. Practice, practice, practice. And in this theory, it doesn't just speed up processing the access. The knowledge representation will also change. It's important to note, though, this takes years to move from declarative knowledge to implicit knowledge.